Albert Paul has spent most of his life behind bars. The 79-year-old inmate has spent a total of 62 years in prison.
My name is Otis Johnson. I went to prison at the age of 25 years old, and when I came out, I was 69 years old.
Alright, so things are about to get really crazy on this list. Make sure you guys wait and see what number 1 is, because it's one of the most heartbreaking situations ever. I feel bad for all of these people on today's list. Well, how's it going, you guys? I'm your host for this one, Landon. Do I ever feel sorry for these guys? And welcome back to another Most Amazing Top 10 video. I just want to say thank you guys to every single one of you guys who have supported this channel over the years. We love every single one of you guys so much, and I just wanted to make sure that we take the time to let you guys know, because I feel like we don't thank you guys enough. Alright, so this is the top 10 innocent people who were sentenced to life. What's that saying? You can say that you'll never commit a crime, but you can't say that you'll never be convicted of a crime. Well, starting off this list in at number 10 with Lamar Johnson, who was just 20 years old when he was arrested and charged with a murder he had nothing to do with. His trial took place back in 2005, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Johnson was wrongfully identified as a suspect following a 911 tip. This phone call to the police came hours after a fatal attack happened. Police followed that lead and it led them to Johnson. Somehow the justice system really screwed up with this one. Well, they kind of screwed up with everyone on this list, but they found Johnson guilty of a horrible crime, even though there was no physical evidence that connected Johnson, and there was no clear motive as well. Eyewitnesses testified during the hearing, and they said that he looked like the gunman. He wasn't the gunman, he looked like the gunman. What did he look like? Just a black guy with a gun? Well, they seemed so unsure, but yet the justice system put Johnson away for life. This is pretty close to a death sentence for a man who did absolutely nothing at all, except for just being a black guy who looked like a gunman. I mean, what did he do wrong? He was just a black guy who looked like the gunman. Well, it took 13 years before the case was reviewed again. They reviewed the physical evidence and it proved that he was indeed the wrong person.
Lamar Johnson taking his first steps of freedom since 2004, when he was wrongly identified as the trigger man and the fatal shooting death of Carlos Sawyer.
Moving into number 9 on our list, we have Kevin Bailey and also his friend Corey Batchelor, who was both 19 years old at the time that they were questioned for a murder that took place back in 1989. So that was 30 years ago. A murder took place in Chicago, and both of these teens were questioned and interrogated for more than 24 straight hours, 5 days after the murder took place. Well, the teenagers couldn't handle it. They were terrified after the threats and physical coercive techniques were used. Well, the teenagers couldn't handle it. They were terrified after the threats and physical coercive techniques were used. So they confessed to the police for the crime, and Bailey was sentenced to prison for 80 years. Is this real life right now? So he would be 99 years old when he got out, and his friend, I'm assuming he's the one that confessed to it, because he took some sort of deal, some plea deal, because he received only 30 years. I think that's a crazy differences in the sentencing. The guy who confessed gets 50 years last time? It doesn't make sense to me. Well, Batchelor was released after serving 15 years, and Bailey served 28 years in prison before he was proven to be innocent. He was just a very afraid teenager who didn't know what to do. Imagine the death penalty was in place. Maybe this is why death penalty isn't a good idea, because what if the convict is actually innocent? Alright, number 8, we have Kenneth Adams, who along with 3 other men who were known as the Ford Heights 4 were wrongly convicted of rape and double homicide. Adam was sentenced to prison for 75 years. A false tip-off to the police from a man who lived near the crime scene led to the arrest of the 4 men. After being held without legal counsel for about a couple days, the men confessed to the crime to a grand jury, and this led to the lengthy prison sentence. Well, this was way back in 1978, and it took 18 years for DNA testing to exonerate Adams from the crime he was convicted of committing. In 1999, the men were released, and they filed a civil claim against the state, and guess what? They won $36 million against the police officers involved in the original investigation. Well, at the time, it was the largest civil rights payment in United States history. I'm sure the money was about $8 million. Well, let me ask you guys this. Would you guys do 18 years in prison for $8 million? Let me know in the comment section below. For me, the answer is hell no. Make it 10 mil. Okay, moving into number 7. This right here is Christopher ABERNATHY, who served 28 years. And just quickly, I just want to give a shout out to the Innocence Project, who have been helping innocent people find freedom. I'll link to them down below. They're a non-profit organization that's been around since 1992, and they're committed to exonerating wrongfully convicted people through the use of DNA testing and reforming the criminal justice system to prevent future injustice. The Innocence Project helped out Christopher ABERNATHY, who lost almost 3 decades of his life after he was convicted of first-degree murder, aggravated criminal sexual assault, and armed robbery. I mean, those are some pretty serious crimes, and a lot to get wrong here, and he was sentenced to life in prison. For all of these years, everyone believed that he murdered a 15-year-old girl, but he maintained his innocence throughout, and in the end, the truth finally prevailed. It just sucks that it took a long time, and as a result of this, he was rewarded $14 million. Number 6, we have a man's fate that was determined in just a couple of hours, and during that time, the lawyers did nothing to protect him.
Talked to a friend of mine, and he said, why don't you just call her innocent? The Innocent Project is the one that gets you out. And from that, all they told us, one day we are both gonna be free.
Okay, so that was Malcolm Alexander, who looks like a man who doesn't have any hate to what has happened to him. I mean, I would hate everything if I had to go through that. Well, this doesn't actually seem like a man who committed the horrible crimes he was convicted of. Back in 1979, he was charged with rape to the owner of a new antique shop in Louisiana. He was falsely identified, but was somehow sentenced to life in prison. This man spent 38 years behind bars, but the Innocence Project was able to finally get him out. After 20 years or even 10 years, I probably would have lost all hope. I don't know what I would do. This guy is just so strong for believing, even after 38 years. I feel bad for complaining now about like things in life that just don't really matter.
Did you tell me that?
I'm crying. You have to wear a princess crying.
Just like that, right, number 5, we have George Allen, a man who spent 30 years in prison until he was finally exonerated on January 18th, 2013 in St. Louis, Missouri. He was convicted for the murder and sexual assault of a young court reporter. So what happened was, initially police had suspected a known sex offender, so they went to question him. Well, officers approached George Allen several blocks from the victim's house, thinking he was the known sex offender, Kirk Eaton. So they took him in for questioning. Detectives Herbert Riley later realized that they actually have the wrong man. But you know what? We're still gonna question him. I don't know why they continued on. Well, I guess those police officers were doing the interrogation. They were able to get anyone to confess because Allen confessed that day to the crime that he never even knew of. Later, it was determined that Allen has a history of severe mental illnesses, including hospitalizations for schizophrenia. So quickly, he was charged, convicted, and sentenced to prison for the rest of his life. Philip Bivens, who served 30 years in prison in Mississippi, is up next on our list at number 4. Bivens was wrongfully convicted of raping and killing a woman back in 1979, and the only witness was a 4-year-old who consistently described the one man. So basically, this man went away for the rest of his life because of a 4-year-old's memory. I don't know if I would go off of those bases, off of those grounds. Originally, the police actually had 3 different men give a confession while they were under the threat of the death penalty, but they weren't convicted because their confession was inconsistent. But for some reason, Bivens, well, he was the man. Bivens was actually very close to getting the death sentence, but the jury members weren't certain about it. Well, that would be insane because Bivens served 30 years in prison, and from what I was able to gather from all the research, inmates are roughly on death row for about 15 years. So this innocent man would have been killed, and then who knows if the truth would have ever come out after that. It would have just been like, okay, he's killed, case closed. Number 3 is Leon Brown, who was all over the news.
2 men were freed from prison in North Carolina today after spending more than 30 years behind bars for a crime they did not commit.
Then his sisters. Family members are angry. It took 30 years for this to happen, but Brown says he's just grateful to be free.
I'm glad you're okay. We're gonna take care of you. You're gonna be all right. Give us back our family, man.
Leon Brown was in the news as a man who served 30 years in prison for first-degree murder and first-degree rape crimes that he never committed, and he was actually given the death penalty. He is so lucky, I suppose, that it took so long to process the death penalty in this case, but he did spend his whole life on death row. So pretty sure this man, because he was on death row, he was in isolation for the past 3 decades, which isn't a life at all, and it seems way harder than the typical life prison. 30 years in 4 small walls with your own thoughts, I mean, what do you do? I'm not even sure how Brown stayed sane. The really messed up part is the fact that Leon was only 15 years old when he was convicted, so the state of North Carolina gave this young teenager the death penalty. Why were the jury members so sure of this? A lot of those jury members might not even be alive today because it happened so long ago. Number 2, Malcolm Bryant.
This is the first few seconds of freedom in more than 17 years for Malcolm Bryant.
Bryant was convicted of killing 16-year-old Tony Bullock in 1998. The trial was a total joke and there was only one eyewitness, and they failed to disclose multiple pieces of evidence that point to another person. Pieces of evidence that was left out left an innocent man in prison for 17 years. Well, this is a sad story because he was released from prison in 2016, but just 1 year of freedom he passed away. He passed away at the age of 42 years old.
I'm just absolutely thankful God.
Exonerated today after long-awaited and detailed new DNA testing.
Alright, number 1, for you guys who made it here, thank you guys so much for tuning in for the whole video. Well, we have Adrian P. Thomas, who was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison back on September 21st, 2008, and it was for murdering his son Matthew Thomas in New York. 4-month-old Matthew was rushed to the hospital by his father after he found him unresponsive. Well, police were involved with this, I guess because the hospital staff assumed the father had something to do with this. Well, during the interrogation, investigators told him that it had been proven that 4-month-old Matthew had passed away from blunt force trauma, and they knew that someone in the household did it. Well, they threatened to arrest his wife and convict her for the murder if he didn't confess, so that's when he confessed. He confessed to everything. He was convicted on the basis of his own confession. Well, 6 years later, it was actually determined that the 4-month-old was killed by a condition known as sepsis. Sepsis is a life-threatening condition that arises when the body's response to infection causes injury to its own tissues and organs. And this can lead to death, and this happens in people who are very young, people that are very old. So Adrian P. Thomas was sentenced to life in prison, all because his son had a very rare condition and he had to mourn his son's death in prison. Is this real life right now? That has to be one of the saddest, heartbreaking stories I've ever heard, and I'm so sorry that this guy had to go through this. I couldn't imagine what he went through. Well, this is the end of the video. I just want to say thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys all in the next most amazing top 10 video.